This clip is intended to be a nutshell contrast and comparison between what happened in Oregon and what's going on in North Dakota right now. I'm shooting it from the Kanosh Paiute Indian Reservation, which is just a stone's throw from where I live and operate in south central Utah. They're my friends. They're my neighbors. I serve on the Kanosh Band Enterprise Board. I'm a big supporter and advocate of Native American interests. I'm also a big supporter and advocate of First Amendment rights, including freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom to assemble, to protest, and to seek redress of grievances. I think it's important to say that because that's basically the foundation for what was going on in Oregon back in January and February. That's the foundation of what's going on in North Dakota today. People exercising their right to freedom of speech, expression, and protest. But having said that, I'd like to draw some contrasts and comparison between how those situations are being portrayed, especially by the mainstream media. If you'll recall, back in Oregon, back in January and February in Oregon, the mainstream media tried to portray the situation at the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge as a very scary situation involving so-called media and firearms and all of those things. They tried to make it look like it was very provocative and that there were all kinds of threats of force and violence and intimidation. And that was the message that the mainstream media attempted to portray with respect to what was going on in Oregon, which the occupiers themselves said that they brought the guns to try to get people's attention, but it was a peaceful occupation. It was a peaceful protest. Now, if you look at what's going on in North Dakota, it's a lot more provocative in a lot of ways. And one of the other differences is it's not all on public land and public property. Everything that happened in Oregon was on public land and public property, versus in North Dakota, there's trespass of private property going on. And part of what's going on in terms of the response to the protest is to try to move the protest off the private property. They're trying to open the state highway so that the protest isn't impeding traffic. And I agree. I'm as concerned as anyone else is about the militarization of law enforcement in this country at the local level and at every other level. I have a big concern about that as well, but it looks like in North Dakota they're trying to be quite careful about that. And the other point I want to make there is that in North Dakota there's an obvious separation of powers between state, local, and federal government versus what happened in Oregon in Harney County in January and February of this year. There was no separation of powers whatsoever between the state, federal, and local governments. There were no checks and balances. That's why they made the stop without any arrest warrants, without any determination that there was probable cause. But in North Dakota, it looks like there is much more separation, which serves as a check and a balance in the whole situation. Despite the provocation of the protesters in North Dakota and everything that they're doing, it looks like local law enforcement is trying to be as careful as possible as they move the protest. They haven't shot and killed anyone yet. That's one of the biggest differences between what's going on in North Dakota and what happened in Oregon. As you'll recall, the only violence, the only actual violence that occurred in Oregon back in January and February was the killing of Lavoy Finicum, which is what the government did. As opposed to what they claimed that the protesters were trying to do. And so I think what we see is a big overreaction and a big demonstration of bias by both the federal government and the media, especially as we contrast those two situations. And something else that I think is a huge contrast is how in Oregon, the mainstream media claimed that it was just a bunch of outsiders there trying to stir things up. And there's no question there were outsiders there. But the same thing is going on in North Dakota. It's just that that's not the message that you hear portrayed by the mainstream media. They try to make it look like almost everyone there are Native Americans, local Native Americans. But the reality is there are a lot of outsiders there. There are a lot of people there who aren't Native Americans. And I support their right to be there, their right to protest. What I am concerned about is the discrepancy in how it's being portrayed by the mainstream media, because there is a big difference and a big double standard. And I think that's one of the biggest differences across the board, and that's one of the things that I want to really emphasize in this nutshell comparison is the double standards that apply between the mainstream media and between the government treatment and approach to those two situations, and I think that basically covers it in a nutshell.